Darren Rovell, we finally get a chance to talk. I just started here at Action Network, but I've obviously known about you for a long time. And I'll say this, about a year ago, so in 2022, I remember where I was when I saw a tweet from you saying that you don't really watch Women's March Madness because there's not enough madness. It's not unpredictable or as unpredictable as the men's tournament. So welcome, coming in hot. And I'm giving you a chance.
I always come in hot.
Giving you a chance to sort of explain yourself. What prompted you to make that take at that time?
Well, I think it's generally true, right? We call it March Madness, and the men, for the most part, certainly in the first two rounds through the Sweet 16, have a lot more upsets than the women. Not only that, the women have a larger variance in terms of the score, the margin of victory, especially in the first round, usually on the 116, 215, 314 games somehow are usually very outrageous, right? Like the UConn game is always like 115-67. And I don't think that necessarily helps women's basketball, that you have such a divide as the men's game has shrunk down in terms of parity. So that's why I made that. With UConn in particular, they, as the number one seed, have basically been the number one seed to the Final Four for like half of all the women's tournaments now. And so I just said that because I said it doesn't help. The unpredictability doesn't help the fight for women's basketball to become more relevant. I am not on the side of women's basketball is a totally different game. That's why I don't watch it. That's not where I am. It's just the idea that during this time, it's called the same thing, the madness, but it is not as mad. And then I'll tell you, then came this year.
Then came this year. Okay, but let's backtrack before we even get there, because I think last year was also a prime example. I remember crunching the numbers, and the amount of upsets, believe it or not, were very comparable for the men's and women's tournaments through those early rounds, as you said. And I think there's a few things at play here as to why in the past there haven't been as many upsets. One of them, as we know, we just have to go back historically. We know that the men's game is a lot farther along just based on when the men's tournament started versus when the women's tournament started. So the men had, say, what, a 50-year head start. We can talk about this in a similar vein as we talk about the NBA and WNBA as well. So I think the women's game is in a different place, right? In the past, I mean, we saw UCLA men win 11 titles, kind of like how we saw UConn. Now, I hear what you're saying about the margin of victory, but when I saw your take, and I totally understand where you're coming from, I think what struck me pretty immediately was that you probably hadn't watched in the most recent years. So we know the last time UConn won a title was 2016. So in the last 5-6 years, we've had a lot of different teams that we've seen winning, and the game itself has evolved so much, even in just the last 5-6 years. And so to me, I was like, okay, I hear what you're saying, but have you been paying attention lately?
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. I think the biggest point you make there is that the women's game is at a different point in their life cycle. And I would tell you that, honestly, I probably had not appreciated that. That makes sense. I do think that there needs to be, the idea of like UConn always winning. Yes, I knew in the recent years they did not always win. But I will say, yes, last year it seemed like there were more upsets. This year, for example, if you just go by seeds, not by odds, there were 12 upsets in the women's tournament. There were 18 in the men's. I do think that Miami winning and going as far as they did, beating number one Indiana, that Stanford going down. Anytime you can have the one seeds go down in the women's, I think it's more important for the growth of the women's game. I think it's more important for the ones to go down in the women than the men. But also that it was particularly Miami. Okay, so this is a new thing that I think is very important for the women's game. The fact that you have the Cavender twins, okay, they, because of name, image, and likeness, they became maybe with the exception of Liv Dunn at LSU, and in some cases she's not even competing on sometimes, but the Cavender twins are very much competing. And the fact that they were able to beat Indiana and go as far as they did, and that's a name that seemingly everyone now knows, I think was the biggest drive to the women's tournament yet, ever.
Well, you bring up the Cavender twins, and I think a greater point is name, image, and likeness. And what it has brought to light the past couple of years, the NCAA allowing players to earn some revenue on their name, image, and likeness, is it's only sort of confirmed what had already been trending, which is that women's athletes are extremely marketable, particularly on social media. And so when NIL first became a thing, we started to see the deals for women's athletes for, say, Paige Beckers or Haley Van Lith, and some of those opportunities coming at a higher rate than the men. But I think it's important that we differentiate between sort of the play on the court and the opportunities off the court, and that driving the business, because as you alluded to as well, with a couple of number one seeds failing to make the Sweet 16 this year for the first time since '95. Also last year, Creighton was a double-digit seed that made it to the Elite Eight, and they had upsets over some big name schools, including Iowa, and Iowa was on their home court. So I know I'm back.
And how about the fact that Creighton then comes back and loses to Mississippi State in the first round? So
and I think I think what you're saying is that's a good thing, right? That
yes.
Creighton then gets a higher seed, then they get upset. So it almost is going along this trend of being less and less predictable.
Let me say one thing. This is always one of the hardest things that I've had, because people say, "Why are you the arbiter of when something is too predictable or not?" You mentioned John Wooden and the UCLA titles. Why is the UCLA men acceptable, and why is the UConn women not acceptable? This is like one of the hardest things. I mean, I've been doing this for 21 years, and obviously Twitter makes it harder because everything is by nature out of context. So it makes it much harder. But, I think there's a sense when it's too much for me. Like, what's a dynasty, which is celebrated and is positive, and what has negativity to it? Like Jimmy Johnson winning 1 million NASCAR titles, I felt was bad for the sport. But the Spurs, they seemed boring. That dynasty was that not good to the NBA. Sometimes people are watching, some people are not. But I think for the women's game, the one thing I resent are the journalists who just cover the women's game saying we should be watching this. No, we shouldn't. We should watch what we think is exciting. But I think that that the best thing that can happen to the women's game, I think, is the unpredictability. And that I think will bring the women's game into the casual landscape, and more people will watch.
Well, I think it's a good point. And as I said, I think over the last few years, you're seeing more and more of that. And to the point where I think right now you can say, not in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years that it's going to be more exciting. You can say that right now because of the upsets that we're seeing. But it's a fine line, right? Because you want unpredictability, but you also, I think, sometimes want some recognizable teams and names in the Final Four. So that's that balance. And I actually think right now, the women's tournament has struck a really good balance between those things. Now, as far as UConn and the Dynasty being good or bad for the sport, I've spoken on this a bit recently. Women's is a unique property because it has dealt in the past with so many hurdles that some of them were societal. Some of them were by the doing of the NCAA in terms of undervaluing it. So we have to look at it in a slightly different lens. Because of that, I actually feel that the dominance of UConn made women's basketball more newsworthy because it was undeniable. Media had to cover something as notable as, 11 championships or undefeated seasons or 14 straight Final Fours. It made the media have to pay attention. And so for that reason, I think it has served a purpose to help women's basketball where it might not have gotten coverage otherwise, because we know historically the disparity between coverage of men's and women's sports has been so great. Now that we're at a point where we're seeing that coverage gap narrow, now I feel that it's actually the perfect time to get some more madness, as you call it. And I also think it's important to note, you said this earlier, women's and men's March Madness, it's both called that, but it was not officially marketed as March Madness by the NCAA until 2022, which is a really long time since they actually branded the tournament March Madness for the men. So they weren't doing themselves any favors by not marketing women's as March Madness officially.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. And I would say you're right. I mean, as someone who lived in Connecticut from 2000 to 2006, and obviously, grew up with Rebecca Lobo and Jen Rosati, and, later, obviously, Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird and all of Gino Auriemma, the fact that you had a program both pretty much in UConn and Tennessee, where the crowd for the women's, but back in when it was Michelle Marciniak and back with Pat Summitt, there was no question the women's game was bigger than the men's, and I think that was important. One of the things I don't choose. I'm not a person who is going to deny when there's something that's bigger, and I put out a tweet earlier, maybe 2 weeks ago or a week ago, when it said, when the Final Four was clear, and that the women were like double the price of on the ticket, and yes, the women's are played in an arena and the men's are played in a stadium, but the women can't do anything about that. They're told they're playing in an arena, and given that, that's the first time I've ever seen since I've been keeping track, even despite the large numbers in a stadium, where the women's game was that much higher than the men's. And obviously the ratings being up, 40% or so. And then there's one more factor here, which is in terms of Stardom. Caitlin Clark, if you watched every men's game and every women's game, her domination and the 41 points was the single biggest domination of anyone in any of these games. It's undisputable. So the fact that a woman had the best performance overall, I think that's also a positive, and I think people are paying attention. And then the fact that, by the way, there's a little bit more business, then she can market her camp. And I don't know who came up with the idea that a 2-day camp for the best star in college basketball is $175 for 2 days. But the fact that she could then market her camp, it could sell out. And I mean, I think people are definitely paying attention more to women's college basketball than ever before.
Well, I just want to clarify my previous statement because I was a little unclear. So the NCAA withheld use of the March Madness brand until 2022. So that was 29 years, just to be clear.
In men's and women's.
Correct. 29 years after they had trademarked it. So, almost.
They actually had to buy the trademark. So they had to do a deal. The term March Madness was come up. The Illinois High School Basketball Association had owned it.
Right.
They got it. Yes. But there was a wide difference between when they made the men's mad and when they made the women.
Right, exactly. And look, there's so many other things we can get into as well, just in terms of the knowledge of women's basketball, and because of lesser media coverage. And I think one thing that's very interesting, and I'm curious your thoughts coming up here, we're going to need a new TV rights deal for women's basketball. And what after the 2022 bubble scenarios, it forced the NCAA to rethink how they were treating the men's and women's tournaments. And one of the recommendations from an independent law firm that reviewed their whole process was, let's look at the TV rights deals. Now, the women's basketball tournament was part of a package, has been part of a package of 28
other championships.
Correct, 28 other title events. And so ESPN paying $34 million per year for the championship package. Now, this is a deal agreed to back in 2011, so we already know that it's not up to market value.
Right. So for reference, so that's a package, $34 million versus the men, which is $1 billion a year. Right. So I think one of the things that you have to do, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but one of the things that you have to do is you have to separate out the women's, just to separate out the women's tournament.
Yes.
Don't make it part of a package. It's not a part of a package.
Exactly. And I think what we've seen over the last several years is that it can be a standalone property, and that was what was recommended by this law firm. And I believe it's going to be sold as such. It's going to be sold as a standalone property, and it should then generate a lot more revenue. And I understand it's not going to be comparable yet to the men's because it hasn't quite gotten there yet. But interestingly, the NCAA has a history of undervaluing not even just the women's tournament. Like, if you look back at the men's deal, it was criticized when that was extended. I believe back in 2016, the original deal was going to go to 2024. They extended it early until 2032. And now looking back, it's being judged as they could have gotten even more money. And I think that has happened at a much larger extent for the women's side, considering that there was never really a great benchmark.
Yeah, listen, TV rights have been a hard thing to do, because when you look at TV rights, every time you negotiate TV rights, it's like, oh my God, one time the gravy train is going to slow down. And so they've done these huge deals, 8, 15 years long deals, and whether it's a disservice or a service, who knows? I'll just tell you this. Yes, there's a lot of eyeballs on, oh, is it enough? But the biggest thing that the women's tournament can do is see these 40% year over year increases, and that just gets ESPN to say, okay, we can value this more for the advertisers. It's a straight up equation here. So like, I'm not looking for the numbers to be anything more than what they are. And the good thing is, they're in a place where advertisers want it more. Now, there's not the same type of competition. Obviously, CBS and Turner getting together on this deal, there's not going to be the same type of competition, but it's going to be commensurate with how many people are watching, because that's when you can get the ad dollars. So that's how the number will be. But I definitely think that separating it out is a must and has to happen, because without that, you're doing deals where you're saying, well, the women's tournament is this, but we can't get that same revenue for men's lacrosse, and we can't. And so then that number, that 34 number, becomes it gets put onto the women on the women's tournament, and maybe they were worth 60. But then when you say, oh, well, we can't do the revenue, we don't have the same revenue for the, we're doing this as a favor, that we have swimming or we have lacrosse. And so I think that's also important to tell the story for the women. They deserve to have it as a separate package.
To take this full circle, I think the business metrics that you have pointed to, that I have pointed to, are all in favor of women's basketball and women's sports in general trending up. And I think that's a reflection of the product itself. And so we are seeing proof that, in fact, there is March Madness for the women's tournament, and the product has gotten better and better. And I think what bothered me when I saw your initial take was what I had mentioned before about the women's sports landscape having a little bit more of a challenge, because let's face it, there are a lot of people that don't want to see it succeed, that want to ignore it, that want to keep it right where it is. And so when you see somebody with the influence that you have to share a sentiment that so many people are so ready to jump on board with, that's what scared me a little bit.
And maybe it's that Twitter is the wrong platform to do this, and this is the right platform to do this. That in if you have 120 characters, again, it's out of context. It's a hell of a game of telephone, right. But it's just out of context, and so that's why it makes sense to discuss, on this level.
I think
can I say one more thing? What's interesting is there's also the debate to say that if you watch the men's game and the women's game right now might be a better game itself. And the reason I say that is because if you look at like the flow, it seems like the women are running plays. It doesn't seem like the men are. Yeah, I'm just telling you that. This is the sentiment I have for women's tennis versus men's tennis. You can tell me all you want about the power game and the serve, but women's tennis has rallies. Mm-hmm. Men, for the most part, that game doesn't. It's a different game. And for a long time, I heard, well, the women's game is layups instead of dunks. I think that's a lazy way to do it. And if you look at it now and you look at the ball flow and the way that the women's game is versus the men's, I'm not saying, the women aren't jacking up the threes in the same way that the men are. I'm not saying they're not, but there is an argument to be made that it's a better game too.
Well, and I think that all starts with giving it a chance. And there's a lot of people out there that are looking for any excuse to not give it a chance. But if you understand the game, if you understand sports in general, and you respect high quality elite athletes, you will give it a chance and you will watch and you will see that it is entertaining, and forget about comparing it to the men's, entertaining in its own right. Like, I think a lot of times we've gotten caught up in the past of saying, doing this comparison game of men and women, and we know there are biological differences. So let's respect the game itself in its own right. For women's athletes and what they're achieving. And I think that's really the overarching lesson of all of this. And I hope, it sounds like you've watched a bit more women's basketball in the past year or two, and that you're going to keep doing it. And I think you're going to be in for a treat.
And I would just say one last thing. I think the important thing for the people who are very strong women advocates is not to dismiss people who get to the women game however they got there.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you think that that you've come to the women game, and obviously they were eliminated because the Cavender twins got NIL deals because of their sex appeal and their game, but if you got there because of that, you got there. Mm-hmm. Don't dismiss that. And I sometimes, that's one of the things that drives me nuts is however people get there, let them get there, let them watch, let them see, however it is. And with the NIL game, it might be. Now, I'm sorry, this is the way it is. It is what it is. It's going to be more sex appeal for the men versus the women, but that's going to happen more often. The women are going to be more known than ever before because of NIL. And maybe related to sex appeal. If that gets someone to watch Miami or gets someone to watch the tournament, I don't think that person should be yelled at for that's why they got there. I still think that's happening a little bit.
Well, just for the record, I'm personally not a critic of however you get there, because my aim is I want more and more people to discover the greatness of women's sports, and in particular women's basketball. As far as what you're alluding to sort of personality off the court and your appeal off the court. And I think that's so important, because I think you can make an argument that women have for a very long time been very, multifaceted. Women can can do more than one thing in a sense as far as marketing is concerned. And so that's where I think it does help. And so, yeah, there's there's obviously a lot going on here, but you know what I wanted to bring up too? Sports betting falls right into that same category. If you discover women's basketball because you want to bet on the game, fine with me.
Which is interesting because a lot of people say, hey, the best value in all of sports betting is the WNBA. I've heard that many times. And the question also, hey, if you looked at the pre-tournament, 64% of all bets at BetMGM, I believe, were on South Carolina. If that's not an opportunity versus the men, where you have 10 teams that are spread between 15% and 8%, I don't know what is. So, if money is your game and you want to look at things that are maybe more lazily bet on, or there's more opportunity, the women's game is not exactly, that small, college game that's just on ESPN Plus. But it is smaller. There are fewer eyeballs, and maybe from a betting standpoint, that is your opportunity.
And I believe it was 2021 that was the first time that every single game of the NCAA women's tournament was nationally televised. How crazy is that? And
Nuts.
In the last couple of seasons, you had first ever women's college basketball game on Fox Network TV, on ABC Network TV. This year is the very first time that the championship game is going to air on ABC Network TV. So, I mean, I just can't imagine what a cultural perception of the men's game would have been had it not had so much network TV exposure up to this point. But I just think in closing here, what's important is we don't want to paint women's basketball as a lesser product. And maybe in the past, that argument would have held up, but it has evolved so much that we can point to it and say, this is a product that has madness. This is a product that has excitement and entertaining players, faces that you've described. And so the numbers are now reflecting that. And so now we have proof that people do find that this is a really entertaining product.
Well, thanks for giving me the call, for telling me you knew where I was when I fired that thing off. And I think, thanks for giving me the opportunity, because again, just because the platform that Twitter is allows you to do something with the speed that it does, it also has many shortcomings. And so to actually have a conversation where you can get further with it, and hopefully, the people out there who are watching this feel the same.
I'm really glad we could hash this out, talk it out. I think it's just super important for context. Context is everything. So, Darren, I really appreciate you taking the time.